As we have seen, the way to modularize in a programming language is to create functions and methods which have a fewer statements, like 10 to 20 statements, and they perform a single task. In order to understand functions, we should also take help of mathematical functions, what mathematical functions are, so that will help us understand functions and modularization a little bit better in programming languages. In a mathematical sense, we have a function. This function takes some input and it gives us some output, and there is some processing this function performs inside, right? The processing is performed on the input, and this processing generates the output. Now consider a mathematical function square. In this case, this function actually squares the input and gives us the output. So if our input is, let's say, 1, the output would be 1. If our input is 2, the output would be 4. If our input is 3, the output would be 9, and so forth, right? So a person who wants to calculate the square of a number doesn't need to know how this function is implemented. Inside, this function may be actually taking the input y and multiplying it by itself, right, in order to calculate the square. But the user of the function does not need to know anything about it. All he needs to do is, if I give him some input number, it will give me the square of that number, and that's about it. Similarly, another mathematical function is cube, right, which actually cubes the number, and internally it's implemented y multiplied by y multiplied by y. So whenever you give it an input of 3, for example, it will give you 27, which is the cube of that number. However, the caller of this function doesn't need to know anything about how this function is implemented. Similarly, the function inside a programming language also hides details of how a function is performed. Okay? So let's take an example of building a car, right? We have a function which builds a car. It takes some parts as its input, and it gives you the car as the output. Now inside this function could be a lot more details, right? This function may internally call some other functions. Let's say build engine is one function that it can call, which basically, and passes it the parts, some parts that the engine needs gets passed here. Okay, and this outputs the engine, and the output goes back to the calling function, right? So it takes some parts, it does whatever it needs to do with those parts, and gives us the end product as the car. Now if I'm looking at from a client perspective, I don't need to know how the car is built. All I need to know is, if I give these parts to this function, it will do its task and give me the car as an output. And that's all I care about. So I treat this part as a black box. I don't know the details what it does. All I know is, if I give him something, it will give me something else. All right? Similarly, some functions have one parameter, right? Whereas other function may take multiple inputs. For example, if we have a function x squared plus y squared, right? Now it needs 2 inputs for it to give us some output. So the one input could be in the form of whatever x value we provide. The other input could be in the form of y value. So if x is 2 and y is 4, it will give us as an output 2 times 2 is 4, plus 4 times 4 is 16. So it will give you 20 as the output.